Oh, this is a little slanted there. Okay. I'll leave it here. Don't drink it, David. Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a delight and a joy to be here to spend this next couple of days with you, all of you. I see so many familiar faces and so many new folks I just can't wait to get mail from. So this is a real pure delight, and you know, I'm just so grateful that Fuller Seminary, Dr. Mao and Mary, you have made the extra effort to make this event happen. And also my sister Young Lee, thank you for driving this forward, and I am just grateful, really grateful that God has given us a chance to come together. Since starting as a pastor this past year, I haven't been in ministry for about, maybe 15-something years. It's been a delight to be able to get back into the saddle of working with people on a more personal level and not just talk about academics. So my presentation might reflect this hybrid of moving away from academia and moving towards ministry, or maybe both. We'll see. But I wanted to start by, as every good pastor does, by reading scripture. And let's take a look together at Luke chapter 15, verse 8 to 10, the theme verses for this event. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and her neighbors and says, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Our panel today, I believe, is going to introduce the theme of that lost coin, the study of history or historical awareness within Asian American and Asian Pacific American communities. So I think my job here is sort of to raise a couple of questions and maybe to give us some sort of a report about what's happening in the academic community as well as the church community, and then maybe even enumerate a few potential themes. David and Helen have some really great ideas that I think will surpass mine. So after that, together, maybe we'll have a chance to have a real good conversation. So 15 minutes, and I will try to be very, very precise and short and concise. Jesus' parable of the lost sheep, the missing coin, and the prodigal son in Luke 15 serve as a backdrop for this presentation. The question I want to raise is, how did this woman know that she was missing a coin? Think about it. Don't all coins look alike? How does she know there was one coin that was missing? Well, we don't know, but I suspect that she had a sense of incompleteness and that disquiet that sometimes we feel when we lose something, like, I left my cell phone someplace, right? You know, that sense that something is missing. I just know it is missing. So among Asian Pacific American Christians, a similar sense of disquiet surrounds us. Something is amiss. Unlike the woman and God, those who notice that our stories are missing from the narrative of Christian history are few and far between. Now, the recent interest in global Christianity has been a very welcome development. Indeed, one of my best experiences during my stint at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley was the opportunity to guide 3 dissertations in the area of Korean church history. But the ignorance of the history of Christianity in Asia, Africa, and Latin America is more than a small coin. As the story of world Christianity justifiably receives greater attention, the story of Asian and Pacific Americans is still missing. Now, most recently, Philip Jenkins has written The Lost History of Christianity, subtitled The 10,000 Years Golden Age of the Church in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and How It Died. His central point is that the expansion of Christianity is not inevitable. Nevertheless, while scholars like Jenkins, Sam Moffat, and many others are traveling, retrieving the histories of Asian Christianity and rescuing it from mission history, the state of Asian American church history remains lamentable. So why is that the case? And I'm going to try to address that in my first subtitle here. I think Asian Pacific American Christianity is not so much missing, but dismissed in church and academy. The previous chapter in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, verse 34 to 35, Jesus quotes, "Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. They throw it away, lest anyone with ears Let anyone who has ears hear and listen. Now, Jesus concludes the previous chapter with this very cryptic remark that seems a little bit out of place in the narrative. Yet it resonates with many in the church and in the academy. If something is irrelevant, or insignificant, or not trendy, it doesn't seem to have a function. It should be thrown away. So insofar as Christians reify the irrelevance of history, and insofar as the Academy reifies the insignificance of Asian Pacific American Christianity, the history of Asian Pacific American Christianity is likely to be dismissed. When one compares this situation with African American or Latino American histories, where religion appears to be so embedded into the fabric of these communities' experiences, it is deplorable that religion, and specifically Christianity, is rendered irrelevant to Asian American history. And David Yu has rehearsed some reasons for this in the first issue of American Asia Journal dedicated to religion in Asian America. So I would refer you to that one because some of those points still resonate today. But let me state a few points a little bit differently about why we're missing. Number one, the Religious Academy is more attuned to religious diversity than racial diversity as an overall statement in general. Thus, Asian Americans are merely considered ethnic or cultural variations of religious traditions. So the study of the way race shapes different religious communities begins to receive more attention only in the 1990s. But since September 11, scholars of religion have begun to give more attention to the study of Islam and issues around Islam in America. So in the process, in the last 10 years, I think that the attention to Asian American and other minority communities continues, but is not always the most faddish or the most faddy, trendy topic. Secondly, Asian American studies, on the other hand, has been more focused on social, political, and economic factors than religion. One even senses a denigration of Asian American Christianity in some circles. Perhaps this is an inverted Orientalism that reifies Christianity as a colonized white man's religion. And that probably needs some unpacking, and I think Dr. Yu, David Yu, will be in a good position to help us do that. Thirdly, social scientific approaches have done a great service by opening up the scholarly conversation around actual Asian Pacific American Christian congregations and organizations. But they are missing the historical richness of the Asian Pacific American experience and unwittingly may reify the notion that Asian Pacific Americans are only recent immigrants, which we're not. So, fourthly, if we look at historians of American religion, they continue to wrestle with how to craft an inclusive narrative of American religion. 20 years ago, Martin Marty wrote an article for Church History that summed up the then current state of American church history. He noted that there had been advances in the history of African American Christianity, but a paucity in Latino and Asian Pacific American Christianity. And today, that paucity still continues and exists. So even though the recent emergence of the history of evangelicalism has dramatically reshaped the history of American religion, the master narrative remains stubbornly the same. Just take a look at that recent PBS series entitled God in America. Have any of you seen that? Okay, if you have, I don't know, I'd like to hear what you thought about it. But that's a good example. And I know that it's very hard in a documentary to be all-inclusive. But it's a very good example of how difficult it is to envision a history that is not centered on white Protestantism. It is very hard, and that is a major struggle. And fifthly, the nature of historical research in Asian Pacific American communities is itself very challenging. So just to identify sources, to equip researchers, and finding the financial resources for this type of research for a marginalized population is very daunting. So as mainstream funding agencies shift further toward a post-racial or multicultural assumptions, ethnic and race-specific resources are drying up. So it behooves the Asian Pacific American churches themselves to support and sustain the historical study of their own communities. They must encourage seminaries and colleges to make Asian Pacific American Christian history, not just Asian Christianity, a priority. While at the GTU, there were very little student interest there was very little student interest in the history of Asian Pacific American church history. Even though we had several great Asian faculty members, most of whom were very interested in supporting Asian Pacific Americans. And at one point, 4 of us, Russell Moy, James Chuck, Mayan Tran, and myself, we had a very strong Asian Pacific American focus. And we even had 2 programs in two seminaries that focused on Asian Pacific Americans, including the one that I directed. But we could not generate enough interest in APA studies from these students and from their churches. So it was then that it dawned on me that our APA church leaders are locked into a born-again-ish theological culture that dismisses history, race, and ethnicity. Most evangelicals possess a historical understanding of life. Salvation is about conversion to a new creation. The old has passed away, the new has come. Thus, the old is irrelevant. This is one of the reasons why many evangelicals are so quick to embrace a post-racial perspective on life. It's also why we try to find shortcuts to building our ministries rather than painstakingly developing historically and theologically informed disciples. We always want to find an easy way out, and we put pressure on seminaries to provide the easy answers. As J. Cameron Carter suggests in his very important study entitled Race, a Theological Account, modern Christian theology and popular culture assumes, quote, a hierarchy of anthropological essences and the supremacy of those of a pneumatic nature within the hierarchy. He's not critiquing Pentecostalism. Okay. He's basically saying that anything rooted in history and race are considered inferior to the spiritual realm. Carter suggests that this tendency is more akin to Gnostic desire to repudiate the Jewish roots of Christianity in favor of a spiritualized Christ. And indeed, this repudiation he labels Orientalizing. By Orientalizing the Jewish Jesus, the Gnostic strategy was to establish a hierarchy of spiritual elites. Thus began what Carter calls a discourse of death, the death of material existence. And this is one of the origins of racial ideology in the West, one from which modern Christianity in its theological and institutional expressions needs to be liberated from. Therefore, the history of APA Christianity faces a double marginalization in church and academy. The worst part of all of this is the self-marginalization of our histories. Insofar as APA evangelicalism embraces this modern discourse of death, the death of material existence, we will never find value in our experiences, our stories, our histories. Indeed, we will pursue the Orientalist strategy of leapfrogging Asian America. So beyond protest, and I'll conclude here because my time is up. I had 2 more sections I'm not going to get to. And I'm sure David and Helen will be able to pick that up. But beyond protest and critique, we must move towards representation in 2 senses of the word, regardless of whether APA Christians worship at or work in an Asian immigrant church, whether they work or worship in a Pan-Asian church or multiracial church or even white churches. Representation, number 1, as a political act of empowering participation. And secondly, representation as an act of self-expression and culture making. In both cases, representation does not occur de novo, nor is it created ex nihilo. It must be grounded in, or at least informed by, history. I'll close by saying I like Irenaeus, just as, well, I shouldn't say that, but just as J. Cameron Carter does, because I think his down-to-earth approach, his passionate heart for the flock and his theology counters Gnostic theology very well, and its attempt to orientalize Jesus. So in the future, it is my hope that we can raise up a new generation of historians who understand this point and will begin to develop new ideas and new themes as resources so that the whole church can benefit. In the end, having found her missing coin, the woman celebrates with her neighbors. Joy and fulfillment is a natural outcome. The search for our missing history is indeed motivated by a desire to correct injustice. That's true. But from the vantage point of faith, this is not the final destination. Joy and celebration with all God's children, not just APA Christians, should be the ultimate goal of engaging our missing histories. The search for our missing histories fulfills not only God's yearning and desire to find the marginalized and the lost, but the church's missional call to invite all to the great banquet. Thank you.